Lecture for the 19th century. In the past, we've talked about how Western Europe has industrialized and also gone through the Enlightenment. We've talked about how the United States also followed in those footsteps, how Latin America failed to industrialize, and we also talked most recently about declining empires, about how the Ottoman Empire was declining and the Qing dynasty was declining. In this lecture, we're going to talk about rising empires in the 19th century, countries that are going to successfully copy Europe and start to adopt the Enlightenment to some extent and also to adopt industrialization. So these notes are in two parts. The first part is talking about Russia. And then when we do part two of this lecture, it'll be talking about how Japan is going to successfully modernize. So what we see in the opening slide here is we're looking at Japan, kind of as a preview to part two, where Japan is going to start the time period with feudalism. We see the samurai warrior on the left, and then at the end of the time period, we're going to see the Japanese military has adopted industrialization and modernization, and they're going to be going out and getting colonies. And so I just wanted this opening slide to show you this transition that happens in Russia and in Japan of these two empires that are going to go from feudalism rather quickly to modern industrialization. So let's start with Russia. So when we last left off with Russia, Russia was still a very feudal country. They were ruled by the Tsar, a monarch, this Romanov family, and Russia has been trying to expand its territory. Now, in the last time period we talked about, 1450 to 1750, we saw that the other European countries had gone out and gotten colonies, and they had started to get colonies in the New World and also around the world in South Asia. And we talked about this competition of nations, and Russia, which is, European as well as being a part in Asia, they didn't want to be left out. So they wanted to also go get colonies, but Russia has a problem. If we look at this map, there is lots of coastline around Russia, but it's all ice. And so Russia doesn't really have access to a year-round warm water port where they could send out ships, trade, get raw materials, get colonies. And so this is always going to be something that Russia is looking for. And so in period two for the AP timeline, 1450 to 1750, we saw European countries going out and doing maritime exploration. And Russia, as we had talked about, was building a land empire. And that process is just going to continue into period three, 1750 to 1900. And most of Russia's land acquisitions at this time are going to be in the south, as we can see on the arrows. And this is going to get Russia into Central Asia, primarily into Islamic areas. And then also east, they'll expand east, and then they're going to butt up against, as we're going to find out, an expanding Japanese empire on the right-hand side of this map. There's going to be some wars going on between these two expanding empires between Russia and Japan. Next, it says Eastern focus and location isolates countries from the rest of Europe. So Russia is always going to be lagging behind the development economically of the rest of Europe. Now we're in period three, and so from 1750 to 1900, we've talked about in previous lectures how, England and Germany and France are industrializing and embracing the Enlightenment and making steps forward economically and politically. But Russia is still mired in the past to some extent. They're physically separated from the rest of Europe because there's a long flat plain that hundreds of miles that separates Moscow from Germany. So there's a reason for their separation. But also, without this warm water port, they can't regularly communicate by sea with the rest of Europe. And so while the rest of Western Europe is making steps forward, like I said, Russia is still kind of stuck in this feudal past. Now, that's not to say that Russia is blind to this. They know that they're falling behind economically. They know that they're falling behind politically as far as adopting new ideas like the Enlightenment. And so previous rulers have tried to modernize. We had talked in the past about Peter the Great. In our unit from 1450 to 1750, Peter is going to go out west and he's going to go to Europe, take a tour, and try to bring these modern ideas back to Russia, but he fails. At the very beginning of this time period, 1750 to 1900, Catherine the Great, another Russian Romanov monarch, is going to try to again modernize and westernize Russia, but she's also going to fail. So Russia again stays in this feudal past where we have a monarch And in theory, they have absolute power, but really a lot of the power within Russia lies among the nobility, or if you remember, they're called boyars, the nobility. And they are these large landowning aristocracy that have a lot of the power, a lot of the land, and the Russian monarch can't just make the changes he or she wants to because it is not in the boyars, the nobles' interest to give up power and let Russia centralize. And it's not in their interest to adopt industrialization. It's not in their interest to adopt Enlightenment ideas because all of these things that are happening in Western Europe, the boyars are going to reject because it might change Russia, it might change the way things are where they have power now. And they don't want to give up power if we adopt some new situation. So Russia just can't seem to keep up, like I said, with the rest of Europe because the boyars are stopping this adaptation of new ideas. And then just to kind of finish up here, we see that the legal system in Russia is favoring the boyars and the monarchy. The boyars and the monarchy don't pay taxes. They're the ones that primarily lead the military. They control the legal system. They have a tight grip on it. So there's virtually no democracy in Russia at the start of this time period. There's no real Enlightenment thinking that is going on in Russia in any kind of significant way that's having an impact. And of course, Russia does not want to, the boyars of Russia don't want to industrialize because if we become an industrial country, well, that'll take away power from the boyars because their power is based on owning land, not capital and factories. And so Russia seems to be stagnating. And then we come to, so now we're on to slide 2, the Crimean War, and from 1853 to 1856, Russia is going to fight a war for conquest. And as we see on the previous slide, Russia's involved in a bunch of wars over time, either going to the south or the east. And so here's one of them. And so Russia is going to attack the Ottoman Empire. Now, if we look back at the last, we see that Russia is making this drive south because they want to get a warm water port, something that's not so far north that they can get access to maritime trade. The problem is that Russia, as you can see in the top right-hand corner of this map in this kind of salmon color, they have access to the Black Sea, but the Black Sea cannot get to the Mediterranean Sea and then out to the rest of the world because the Russians have to go through the Ottoman Empire if they're going to go through the Bosphorus, if they're going to go through from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And the Ottoman Empire, it's not in their interest to let the Russians do this. And so the Russians realize that they're going to have to attack the Ottoman Empire if they want to be able to get that warm water port that has access to the rest of the world. So they attack the Ottomans. Another reason they attack the Ottomans is that the idea of nationalism has reached Russia. If you remember in our previous notes, we had talked about how nationalism results from the French Revolution, this celebration of your people, their ethnicity, their history, their language, this commonality that brings it all together and we're going to celebrate. Well, Russians belong to this larger ethnic group called Slavs. And so the Russian Slavs, they say, well, we're powerful, we're great, and so we should be able to, overtake the Ottoman Empire, and they're weak, and, they're not Eastern Orthodox, they're not Christian, they're Muslim, and they're not Slavic, and so we're better than them, and we should be able to take it over. So this is encouraging the Russians to make this attack. Plus, if we look at the map where it says Ottoman, just where that O is in the Ottoman, that's the Balkan Peninsula, and there's lots of Slavic people who live there, and so ethnically, they're very similar to the Russians who are in Russia. And so the Russians in Russia, the Slavs in Russia, they don't like that these Slavic people are under the control of some foreign influence like the Ottomans. All Slavic people should be together under one flag. It's very nationalistic. And so that's another reason. This is kind of a cultural, political reason for the Russians to attack the Ottoman Empire, to unite these Slavic people under one rule. Next is that the Ottoman Empire is a very tempting target. As we had talked about in our previous notes, it is a declining empire. They are also been having forces inside of their empire resisting industrialization and modernization. And so their decline, their armies are not very modern. The Janissaries don't want them to be modern. And we had talked about, and so the Ottoman Empire has tried to make some reforms, but they're just not keeping up. And so the Russians think, well, we can knock off this kind of quote-unquote third-rate empire. We can do this. It's not like we're attacking England or anything, or this rising power that will come in about 20 years, Germany. And so they think, well, the Ottoman Empire is weak. Let's kick them when they're down. Let's go ahead and take them. The outcome of the war is that it's a total loss for the Russians, and this is shocking to them because they thought they were this mighty empire and they're attacking these, this backward Ottoman Empire, and they might have been able to beat the Ottomans, but the Ottomans are going to get all kinds of military and financial aid from the countries of Western Europe. The countries of Western Europe, especially England, they don't want the Russians to win this war. Because if they do, then the Russians are going to expand their territory, they're going to get that warm water port that they wanted for so long, and Russia may rise to greatness. And England just does not want the competition. And so kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. The British are going to give military weapons and money to the Ottomans to bolster their military so they can fight back against the Russians and defeat them. Now, this is going to have an important political and psychological impact on the Russians. When they lose this war, it's right in their face that oh my gosh, this is the price we pay for not adopting industrialization and modernization. Right? The Ottomans were only able to beat us, the Russians say, because they got modern help from the British. And if we're going to be a country that can be strong and powerful and proud and expand, this war really brings it to them that they're going to have to become a much more modern country to be able to compete with the rest of the European countries. And so this is a turning point, if you will, an important one for the Russians. It makes them wake up and realize we better embrace some reforms and some changes to bring our country into the 19th century. And so that leads us to slide 3, reforms. So the first thing that the Russian Tsar does is like, okay, in order to come to a modern economy, we cannot continue to have serfdom. We cannot continue to have feudalism in Russia because it limits our food production. If you remember from our discussions way back when we were talking about Unit 1 from 1200 to 1450, feudalism is a way of organizing your economy that it's all based on land ownership. And the nobles, in this case the Russian boyars, own all of the land, and the workers, the vast majority of people in Russia, are peasants or serfs, semi-slaves, and the nobility owns all the land, and the peasant works it for them, and they don't really get paid, and there's no incentive to work hard for the peasants, because it doesn't matter how much I work and how much food I produce, those boyars and the czar is just going to take it anyway. And so Russia, which is also a very far northern country, so they don't have a long growing season, are always shy of food. They don't have enough food for everybody. And so if we're going to industrialize, the Russian Tsar says, we need to have increased food supplies so that we can have enough food for not just our peasants in the countryside, but also enough food for workers in my future factories that won't be able to farm. And so we need to have a surplus of food to be able to feed those people living in cities that are going to be working in factories. And so how do I increase food supply, the Tsar said. And one is like, first of all, we have to use incentivization. And so he is going to abolish slave serfdom in 1861, an important date to know. And so now serfs are going to get some of their own land, right? So let's kind of skip ahead to that. The government is going to give some of the land to the peasants. So this is land reform. Remember, we had talked about something about this in Latin America, where the poor people in Latin America were always agitating for the government to give them land reform, and they never quite did. But if I'm a peasant now, and we end serfdom, and we start to redistribute land from the boyars, the nobles, to the people, now I have incentive to work. Now I own the land, not the nobility, and if I work extra hard and I make excess crops, then I can sell those crops and buy my wife a new dress or put a new roof on my cottage or whatever. And so we see this is going to make food production go up, and the whole point of that is that we have enough excess food to feed our future factory workers in the cities. So let's now go back up a little bit where it says not compatible with industrialization. We had talked about in Latin America how one of the reasons why Latin America doesn't industrialize at this time is that they had a very small middle class in Latin America. There weren't enough consumers in Latin America to buy potential Latin American factory goods, and so we just didn't see industrialization start. We had also talked in our previous notes about how slavery is going to end in the British Empire, and they made a purposeful decision, not just because the Enlightenment says we should do it, but also because slavery wasn't compatible with industrialization. You need workers who get paid, who can then afford to buy the products that our factories are producing. No factory workers. Factory workers are not just workers, they're consumers, and if they don't get paid, then they can't buy our goods, and so we can't industrialize. And so the same theory applies here with Russia. If we just have a whole bunch of serfs who don't get paid at all, it doesn't matter if we build factories in Russia because our people will never be able to afford any of the goods. So we don't have a market. And so for these two reasons, because we want to increase food supply and we want to be able to have future consumers, and so we can't have serfs anymore, we have to have people who get paid, who make a profit to be able to afford goods, we get rid of serfdom in 1861. All right, we'll come back and talk about government forces some peasants to move to the city. We'll talk about that later. Now, so the peasants do get the land. So here we see in this bottom right-hand picture this poor Russian peasant. He's not very happy because he was a serf and he was always working for a boyar or a noble and had no freedom and no money. But now he's going to turn that frown upside down. He's going to get excited because now we have taken some money, some land from the boyars, and we've given it to the peasants and like, okay, go work hard. And so he's excited that he is now going to have his own food, he's going to have his own money, and now he can start to afford some of those products that Russian factories are going to start to churn out. However, nothing is ever always good in Russia. At this time, we see that the reality of the situation is that the peasants will get land, but to keep the boyars happy, the Tsar has to promise them that he'll increase their tax revenues from the peasants. And so it's kind of a good and bad thing, right? The government is going to give the peasants land and serfdom, and they're excited about that. Oh, yay! And then, but there's a catch. You guys are going to have to pay extra high taxes because I don't want the boyars to rebel. And so the Tsar says, look, you guys are going to get the land, but you're going to have to pay high taxes and all. And so this poor peasant, he was very excited to get his land, but now taxes have gone up to keep the boyars happy. And then here's the catch. A lot of the peasants won't be able to actually pay the high taxes, and so the land reverts back to the boyars if they can't pay the taxes. And so this land reform is not all that successful. We've talked about the reasons for it, and we've talked about how it was supposed to go into effect, but let's talk about the real outcome is that, yes, peasants did get land, but because the Tsar needed to keep the boyars happy, he promised to increase taxes on the peasants, and that money would go to the boyars. But the peasants couldn't pay the taxes, and so in the end, there really wasn't that much land reform because a lot of the land went back to the nobility, the boyars. So again, we see Russia struggling to modernize. So that's all economic stuff. Let's now look at the impact of the Enlightenment on Russia. Because Russia, just like Latin America, just like the Ottomans, just like the Qing, they want to keep up with Western Europe. And so they're like, well, what has worked in Western Europe? Well, they've embraced the Enlightenment. Is that what made them powerful? Maybe. They've embraced industrialization. Is that what's made them powerful? Maybe. And so we don't know exactly what has made Western Europe and the United States leap ahead, but let's copy it all, right? If you can't beat them, join them, and let's just copy it all. And so we've talked about, on the previous slide, the land reforms and the hope for industrialization. And on this slide, we're going to talk about Russian attempts to adopt Enlightenment reforms. And so it starts with Zemstvos. And so these are small elected assemblies that happen at the village level all throughout the Russian Empire. And you can see a picture on the top right-hand corner. And these elected assemblies, villagers who are now free, no more serfdom, they will vote for people to represent them on these Zemstvos, these assemblies. And these assemblies will take care of the peasants now that the nobles aren't going to. We're going to make sure there's education in the village, which is an Enlightenment idea. More education means more opportunity. We're going to try to help people with health concerns. We're going to make sure that everybody has access to a little bit better of health care. If you're an orphan or your husband died and you're a widow, we're going to make sure that you're taken care of. All of these are very Enlightenment ideas that everybody's going to have more opportunity, more economic democracy, more educational opportunity to improve your life. And so these Zemstvos are trying to, instill at the very local village level Enlightenment ideas for villages. Obviously, there's a catch. These boyars, who, like I've said before, are very influential and powerful. The only way the Tsar could create these Zemstvos, these assemblies, was to let the boyars have some say in them. And so the boyars are going to have even though they're not elected, they're going to still have power to control a lot of the decisions that are made by the Zemstvos assemblies, which you can bet these nobles are going to try to limit the independence and the democracy that is trying to flourish under these elected assemblies, because it's not in the nobles' interest to let things change. They like things very much the way they have been because that's where they have power. And so this is a thing that's keeping these reforms from being successful, once again, these nobles. Now at the national, so this is all very local. At the national level, the Tsar, of course, is going to retain control of foreign policy and issues that involve the whole entire nation. So he's not really giving up very much power. And so the Russians are flirting with the Enlightenment a little bit, but they don't want to date it. They're not really going to, embrace it as much because, once again, these boyars don't want change. They're going to block the Tsar any step of the way they can. But there is some good news for the Enlightenment, is that as part of these reforms, the Tsar is going to have judicial reforms. And so in the past, when villagers or serfs got accused of something, of a crime, or they had an argument, they would have to go to their local boyar or noble to settle it. And that noble had dictatorial power. He could just decide whatever he wanted. And that's not very democratic. But now what we're going to do is we're going to guarantee that Russians, to some extent, have a trial by a jury of their peers, not the noble. And so this is an Enlightenment idea, right? People are going to get a free trial. Their fate is not just at the whims of somebody that's not elected by them or doesn't represent them. All right, we'll skip the justice of the peace. I think that's too much detail for us right now. And so what we see is there is some impact of the Enlightenment on Russia, but there are also some limits to it. Now let's continue on with some reforms. So that was Enlightenment reforms. So let's come back to economic reforms. And so the Tsar, he's like, okay, so what we need to do is we need to industrialize. We need to be like the West. But he's not going to just embrace capitalism, because in capitalism, right, you have laissez-faire ideology where the government should get their hands off the economy and just let people, capitalists with money, just kind of make investments and open up factories and let it go. And that's too much freedom for the Tsar. He would be giving up too much control over his country. Plus, he doesn't want to wait around for this to happen. He needs industrialization to happen now. Right? He doesn't want to wait. And so what he does, he says, we are going to industrialize, but it's going to be under government direction and government control. One, because I don't want to lose power, and two, because I need to have it happen now. So this is much different if we're looking at for comparisons. This is much different than what we see happening in the UK and in the United States, where it was more government's hands-off, laissez-faire, let capitalists make decisions. So in all of these areas, one of the main themes of the course is that you have to understand how transportation and technology played a part in industrialization. And again, continuing that comparison theme, when we were covering the United States, we saw that the Transcontinental Railway was built, and that connected the raw materials of the western part of the United States to the factories of the East, and it connected factories to markets. So it was important to have a quick, efficient, cheap means of transportation for industrialization. In England, we had talked about canal building as well as trains. So in Russia, the Tsar says we are going to build a railway across our country, which is huge, called the Trans-Siberian Railway, and it's going to connect, it's just the opposite of the United States. It's going to connect the factories of the West with the raw materials of the Far East. It's going to connect factories to consumers. And so here's another example of technology, in this case trains, having an impact in helping countries industrialize. Now, so we've built these factories. So the Tsar is going to say, okay, we are going to build factories in Russia. The government is commanding it. We're going to do it. But then how do you get the people, these newly freed serfs, peasants, how are you going to get them to buy Russian-made goods and not English-made goods or American-made goods that are much cheaper, much better, because they've been industrializing way before you? And so the Russian Tsar uses the tried and true method of creating protective tariffs. And we've talked about this before, right? A tariff is a tax on imports. And so if you're a Russian peasant, right? Before tariffs, you had the choice of buying some Russian-made good that was made in a brand new factory that really doesn't know what it's doing, and so it's expensive and not very good. Or you can buy a cheap foreign-made good that's coming from the factories of the UK or America, because they know what they're doing. They've been doing industrialization before, and so the peasants are going to choose the foreign-made goods. But that means we're never going to get any factories being built and maintained in Russia. Our Russian factories will never prosper. And so the Russian Tsar puts heavy tariffs on foreign-made goods. So now if you're a Russian peasant, you have to buy goods made in Russia because the foreign goods have been taxed. That's what a tariff is. Their prices have been raised because of these huge tariffs or taxes, and so now we see Russian peasants, by way of tariffs, are being forced to buy Russian-made goods, and that's going to create customers for our new factories, and that's going to help our baby factories grow and prosper and industrialize. Next, of course, we don't have the money to do all of this because the Russian Tsar is rich and powerful, but he doesn't have the money to just like build factories out of nowhere. And so even though he's saying we're going to build factories, he lets it be known to the UK and the United States and Western Europe. He's like, look, we're industrializing here. It's a great time to get on the ground floor of this investment opportunity. And so he courts capitalists from the United States and England and Germany. He says, why don't you invest in our factories? Guarantee they're going to be a success because I'm going to make them a success. I have the power to do that. I'm going to pass tariffs and you're going to make a lot of money. And so Russia has this kind of hodgepodge way of going about industrialization. They're going to have state-sponsored, state-directed industrialization where the government says we're going to do this. But they also encourage private capitalists to come in to boost that growth of industrialization. So we're kind of in between state-sponsored industrialization, which we'll see in Japan, and capitalism, which we see in the West. It's kind of Russia's in between these two. So all of this quick, rapid industrialization is going to come with a price. You can't just change a whole society overnight and not expect there to be some friction that develops, some protest that develops. And we're going to see that on the next slide. And so protest. Number 4. So these peasants, these poor Russian peasants, they were all just previously in serfdom and not free. And then the Russian Tsar says, you're free, yay, but we're going to have you pay heavy taxes. Oh, and then he says, you're free, yay, but we're going to forcibly take thousands of you off of your village homes, and we're going to have you travel hundreds of miles and go work in these new Russian cities that are growing, and we're going to make you be factory workers away from your family. Oh, and so you can't, when you move thousands of people against their will and tell them you have to become a factory worker, we're going to see that the workers, as you can see in the top right-hand corner, they're going to start to protest. And these workers have also heard about the Enlightenment. They've heard about the democratic changes going on in the rest of the world. And they're like, well, what about us? Why don't we get a say in any of this? And so they're frustrated that their way of life is changing, where they live is changing, and they're not getting these democratic reforms that other countries are getting. So let's focus in now, since once the people have been rooted from their farms, some of the people, and put in these factories that the Russians are opening up, what was life for them? Well, obviously it's isolating because they've been taken away from their villages that they've known for a long time, and that's going to make them mad. In addition to that, they're also going to face the same problems that industrial workers face around the world. It doesn't matter the time period. We're going to see that workers are forced to work for really long hours because the purpose of these factories is to make money and to be successful, and so you want to work the workers as long so they can make as much a product as possible. We're going to have them have really low wages because that's the purpose, is to make money and not have your workers get rich, but the people who own the factories get rich. And of course, poor working conditions. Because if I'm going to ventilate this factory, that's going to cost me money. If I'm going to properly light this factory, that's going to cost me money. And so to save money, I'm going to have just tell the workers, just deal with it. Now, in most countries we have talked about, whether it's the UK or the United States or Germany, when workers are facing these conditions, they start to protest by forming unions. Right? Unions are groups of people that come together and demand their rights. They demand higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. But that's not going to happen in Russia because the Tsar doesn't he doesn't want people to tell him what he can or cannot do. And so he's like, look, you guys are going to just work in these factories, and I don't want you to form unions, because unions mean you're challenging my authority. I said you're going to work in these conditions under these pay and these hours, and that's what we're going to happen. And in unions, if we allow unions to happen, well, they're going to be like, well, no, we're not. And you're going to have workers coming together. And poor people coming together it always makes rich monarchs very frightened, because, they could rebel. And so these workers have really no peaceful way of protesting like they did in other countries, forming a union. And so let's add a little bit of that too, is that Russia is going to send a lot of its young people to the United States. They're going to send them to Western Europe, and they're going to say, look, go to these universities, learn how to be businessmen, learn how to be engineers, learn how to design things, and come back and help Russia modernize. And that's all well and good, but when we send these young people to these universities in the West, they don't just get exposed to math and science, they also get exposed to Enlightenment ideas that are flourishing in the West at this point. And so when these Russian men come back, these young Russian men come back to teach us how to be businessmen and how to run these factories properly and how to design new machinery, they also are going to bring back their Enlightenment ideas. Like, well, why don't we have these? Why can't we let unions happen? Why isn't there more democracy? Who says the Tsar should have power over us? And so this is an unintended consequence of sending these young people abroad. Oh, they get these dangerous things called ideas that they come back with them, besides just the practical stuff of math and science. And so here's a key point, that if you don't allow people to peacefully protest and gain better lives, then people become more and more radicalized. If my life is so bad, and I have no peaceful way of making it better, well, then I might I might become more radicalized, and I might ask for the government just to be overthrown, or I might, grab a gun, and I might, rebel against the government. When governments don't give in to the people's wishes, eventually push comes to shove, and the people will rebel. And that didn't happen in the United States and Germany and Great Britain, because even though there was lots of labor violence, eventually reforms were passed that helped working people have better lives. And so their tension went down and they didn't have to rebel. But in Russia, it's a much different instance, where we've industrialized quickly and people want better lives, they want to protest, they want to form unions, and the government says, no, no, no. And so the only thing that's left is for them to become more radicalized. And eventually this will culminate in a revolution, the Russian Revolution, but that's in the next time period. That's in 1900 to 2000, and so we won't get to that right now, but you will see as we go through these notes that we are headed down that path of revolution. Socialists and communists want the government to be led by the workers. They want to get rid of the Tsar. This is much more radical than unions. Unions just want better lives, right? They just want better working conditions. But when they don't get that, now we become political. Now we become radicalized, and the government should be run by workers. And if the government's run by workers and not the nobles and not the Tsar, then the government's going to give us a better life, because we will be the government. Even more radicalized is we see the growth of anarchy in Russia, not the Soviet Union, in Russia. And these people are really radical. Their lives have been so miserable, and they think that the government is never going to listen to them. Let's just tear down all government. Right? Let's just overthrow the Tsar and have no government. And we see this, again, when people don't get a chance to have the government listen to them and reform, they become one step more radicalized and one step more radicalized until they become the most radical you can get, and as an anarchist, and say, let's just overthrow all the government. So that's workers in Russia. Let's take just a moment to also talk about ethnic minorities. We'll talk about it on this slide and the next. We had seen on previous slides that Russia is expanding into Central Asia, into predominantly Muslim areas of the world. So they're not Slavic, and they're not Christian, which is what most of Europe is. And so these Muslim ethnic groups from various places, whether they're Kazakhs or whether they're from Uzbekistan or whatever, they don't seem to fit into the rest of Russia, and Russia's telling them what to do. This is the Tsar is saying, you will work in this place, you will pay these taxes, But these ethnic groups have heard about the Enlightenment. They've heard about democracy and self-determination and being able to run your own life. And we don't like these Russians telling us to do. And so we're going to see friction develop in this Russian Empire between the Muslim minorities and the Christian czar who's in charge of them. And we'll talk more about that as we go, and certainly into the 20th century. So let's talk about, that's a nice segue to repression. And so as people start to protest this forced industrialization and this lack of Enlightenment freedoms, the Tsar starts to clamp down. Instead of listening to them, his first response is to clamp down. And so he continues to use a tradition in Russia of the secret police to find out who the agitators are and arrest them. And then they'll either be executed outright, or they'll be sent into exile into Siberia, which is in the northern part of Russia. It's very cold up there. You put into work camps and you probably or work to death or starve to death, or you don't come back. Or we just outright kill the protesters. And so so that's the path the Russian government takes. Instead of reforming and listening to the people, they say, no, we're going to repress the people. So now let's focus on a specific group. We've talked about the ethnic Muslims in Russia. Let's now talk about the Jewish population of Russia. There is a large Jewish population of Russia living in diasporic communities, small Jewish communities that are primarily rural, they're primarily peasants, and they also don't fit in because of the rise of pan-Slavic nationalism. We had talked about that earlier, where Russian people are celebrating being Russian, being Slavic, and we're great and we're amazing. And when things don't work out well, with all these protests going on, instead of the Russian Tsar saying, you know what, my bad, what I've been doing, I've been pushing too fast, too hard, and so he needs a scapegoat. He needs somebody to blame all of Russia's problems on. And so the Jews are an obvious choice because there's a history of anti-Semitism in Europe and certainly in Russia. And so it's a minority group that's small enough that we don't have to worry about them rebelling and overthrowing the government, but it's also big enough that you may know somebody who is Jewish, and so they can be a visible target. And so the Russian Tsar kind of redirects some of this anger that's at him, and he says, no, we would have been successful, your lives would have been better if it wasn't for the Jews. And so people, instead of getting mad at the Tsar, they get mad at the Jews, and so we see this Jewish person being attacked by a mob of Russians. And so we've already talked about the scapegoat. And so Russia launches a program of specific persecution of the Jews, taking their land away from them, or taking their money away from them, or blaming them for some of Russia's problems. And so this is called a pogrom. A pogrom is a word. It means that when a government officially persecutes one religious group or ethnic group. And that's certainly happening in Russia at this time. And so what are you to do? And so it's the Jews that could afford it and could get out, they decided, well, let's migrate, right? They're being religiously persecuted. They're having their property taken away. And so because of the new inventions in steam power, trains, and steamboats, the cost of migrating and traveling around the world has gone down quite a bit at this time. And so we're going to see thousands of Russian Jews leave Russia at this time, and a lot of them will go to the United States. The United States at this time is going through their industrial revolution, so there are jobs there. There's more religious freedom in the United States, so you won't have to worry about getting killed in a pogrom. You'll still face discrimination, but not as much as you saw in Russia, because the United States is not actively trying to kill and persecute Jews as an official policy. Unlike most immigrants, these Russian Jews will travel as whole families, because there's no, you're not going to just, as you're the dad, leave to America and say to your wife and kids, see ya, I hope you have a good life. And so we're going to see that the Jewish-Russian immigration is a little bit different than most immigrants. They're going to come to America and they're here to stay. And they're here to come as families. Most immigrants that we've talked about in other notes are going to be young, single, male, and they're going to go to some place to get a job, and a lot of the time they may come back to their mother country and then maybe go back to the United States or back to Latin America to work for a while and then come back and then kind of skip back and forth. But the Jewish immigration is much different for the reasons we've talked about. It's going to be more permanent leaving, and it's going to involve families, not young single men. Once the Jews then do get to, we'll say, the United States as one of their destinations, of course they're going to reform diasporic communities, form small little communities where they feel safe and it's familiar. The most famous example of this is the Jewish community in New York City on the Lower East Side. So there's an example of a diasporic community at this time. Let's go back. Now, so the last thing on this slide, and so it's not just Russian Jews who are immigrating at this time, leaving the country. We're also going to see that Russian peasants that are unhappy with the way their lives are going, the boyars are increasingly taking the land back because the peasants can't pay their taxes, so let's leave. Let's go someplace better. Or we're going to see factory workers that have been forced to work in these horrible conditions in Russia. Like, well, maybe things are better in England, or maybe they're better in Germany, or maybe they're better in the United States. And so we're going to see Russians, if they can get out, they're going to be on the move to try to go other places. So back to expansion. And so those are the internal conditions that are going on in Russia at this time. And so let's talk about some of the wars that Russia fights. Now, the Tsar is going to want the Russians to fight wars, one, to keep expanding because empire means you're powerful. Also, it's going to make people feel great about him if he wins wars. It also is going to feed that pan-Slavic nationalism. Look, the Slavs, the Russians, they're great because we can win all these wars, all hail Russia. And so, those are the things that are going to be driving expansion, but also it's going to serve to kind of distract from your internal problems. As we see the rise of socialism and communism and anarchy and protests, people are angry at the Tsar, and so yes, he uses pogroms to distract people, but also you can use wars to distract people. You could say, look, now is not a time to protest. Mother Russia is in a war, and we're having success, or we're struggling, or, be patriotic. And so we're going to see, for all of these reasons, Russia is going to start to try to fight wars to expand. And so one of the ones we're going to talk about, while it's technically out of the time period, this time period is supposed to end at 1900, but it's close enough that I think it helps us make the point that we've been making throughout much of this lecture about nationalism and expansion. As it's close enough, so we're going to talk about the Russo-Japanese War. So that means it's a war between Russia and Japan in the early 1900s. And if you remember from way back in the beginning of this just internally long lecture, we had talked about how Russia was expanding east and rubbing and punching up against Japan. And so on this map you see on the top right-hand corner, Russia's in brown, Japan's in red, and these two empires are expanding, Russia to the east, the Japanese to the west, and of course they're gonna bump into each other. And the real piece of territory that they're arguing over is Manchuria. Manchuria is this kind of orangish color on the map, and in the past that was controlled by the Qing Empire, but as we've already talked about in a previous lecture, the Qing Empire is rapidly declining and cannot hold on to its empire. And so the Japanese see a chance to take Manchuria. The Russians want it too. Manchuria is full of natural resources, most especially coal, which both industrial Russia and industrializing Japan need to run their factories. And so these two countries are going to fight a war over who was really controlling this area of Manchuria. The Japanese are going to win, which shocks the Russians, because they thought, oh, we're the Slavs, we're best, we're not going to lose to Asians, and because obviously they would say that white people are superior, and we can't lose to Asians, and they do. And it's because Japan has done, as you'll find out in part 2 of this lecture, a much better job industrializing quicker and modernizing their military and their navy. And so when they fight this war, the Japanese win, which is very disheartening for the Russian Tsar. So the loss of the war to these quote-unquote inferior Asian people is going to have people lose confidence and thus legitimacy for the Russian Tsar. Taken on top of everything else going on at the time where people are upset with the Tsar for the forced migrations into factories and the poor working conditions, the lack of Enlightenment ideas, the Tsar faces a real problem. And so we have this thing called Bloody Sunday. So again, 1905. So poor people, poor Russians, they march on the Tsar's palace and they demand more reform. We want to be able to feed our kids. We want our kids to be educated. We want to be able to form unions. We want to be able to have more land ownership. We want to have more control over the government. you're not a very good leader. You've lost this war against the Japanese. And so, again, the Tsar has a chance. He could listen to the people and say, you're right. What was I thinking? We've made mistakes. Let's give you Enlightenment reforms. But the Tsar's impulse, again, is to clamp down on the protest. And so he orders his army and to kill the protesters. 130 protesters, more or less, are killed in cold blood. And it shocks the nation that the Tsar would do this to his own people. So that's Bloody Sunday. And so the peasants hear about this massacre of the Tsar's troops against his own people, and they start to openly discuss physically rebelling, rising up against the boyars, rising up against the Tsar, and taking land for themselves and overthrowing the government. So things have deteriorated pretty quick here in Russia for their government. And so we see in the bottom right-hand corner, workers start to form these things called Soviets. A Soviet is a word that means just a group of factory workers who have banded together, who are politically active, who want the government to be controlled by the people, the workers, and not the nobility and not the Tsar. And they also start to arm themselves. So these little groups of workers, they're not big enough to be called unions, they're a little bit smaller than that. They start to agitate for change. And here you see them arming themselves, like, we want the workers to be in charge. Because of all of this, the Tsar is getting pretty nervous, and he realizes, finally, I better pass some Enlightenment reforms. And so the Tsar creates this thing called the Duma, which is like a national legislature. And he says to the peasants, look, calm down. I've made some mistakes. I understand you guys want a better life and you want more control over things. So I'm going to let you elect people to a legislative body that's called the Duma. And these representatives who represent the people, I will work with the Tsar, as the Tsar, I will work with the Duma, and together I will hear you through your elected representatives in the Duma, and we'll make changes and we'll make the government a better place for everybody. However, it's really just window dressing. If it does work for a while, the people are excited that they're going to get to elect people for the first time ever to represent the common people in this Duma. But as they will find out, the Duma really doesn't do much. He's not really going to give up power and really work with the Duma. He's really going to keep most of the power for himself and the nobility. And so this is very disappointing and disillusioning for the people of Russia, and their problems will continue as we get into the 20th century, where we see that there will be eventually a communist revolution in 1917, which is too far out of this time period for us to discuss. The last thing we have for part one is that the country has been weakened externally, losing this war with the Japanese, internally, having all these protests and strikes and people upset. And so the country's pretty weak, and the Tsar is afraid that the newly created country of Germany, which is only about 35 years old at this point, this rising power in Central Europe, he's afraid that these Germans, the German Empire is which is on Russia's border more or less, it's close enough that it's they might be threatening Russia. And so what happens is Russia secretly, the Tsar makes a secret treaty with France to protect them. Because he's like, maybe Germany, if they do attack us, as long as we have France on the other side of Germany, maybe we won't be conquered by Germany. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in period 3, which is the 20th century, this is going to be one of the issues involved in making World War I a much wider war. This treaty is going to drag Russia in, and it's going to drag France in, and all of their other allies into making World War I a small event into a world war. So we'll talk about that when we get to it.